So Chapter 8 looks at the death penalty as it pertains to specific populations of people. So, as we all know, race relations in the U.S. has a very long and painful history. That includes slavery, Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, etc. And many times the rights of African Americans have just been blatantly ignored. So it makes it difficult to imagine that the death penalty could be administered in a racially neutral manner. So, African Americans have been convicted of capital crimes, so remember those are crimes eligible for the death penalty, and executed in greater numbers than whites. In 1856, slaves in Virginia could be convicted of 66 capital crimes, but only murder carried the death penalty for whites. Attempted rape of a white woman was a capital crime for blacks until the mid-20th century in 7 southern states. 50% of people executed from 1800 to 2002 in the U.S. were black, now, despite being only 11% of the population. 53% of those executed between 1930 and 1980 were black. And in 1990 Government Accounting Office report, which looked at 28 studies, 75% of those studies concluded that black defendants were more likely than white defendants to receive the death penalty. Kramer testified before the House Select Committee of North Carolina on the death penalty and said from 1910 to 1961, 133 blacks and 36 whites were executed in North Carolina. And since 1984, that situation has changed dramatically, with 13 blacks and 28 whites being executed. Nationwide, though, there are still proportionately more blacks than whites on death row, and proportionately more blacks have been executed since 1976. So blacks are overrepresented relative to their proportion of the general population by 3 to 1. So there's 3 times as many African Americans represented on death row than in the actual population. And here we could see a breakdown of the race of defendants executed since the death penalty was reinstated. So how do we know if there's bias in the death penalty? Well, we need to compare each race's proportion of murderers with its proportion of executed people. Bloom, Eisenberg, and Wells looked at 31 states that sentenced 10 or more people to death between 1977 and 1999. In California, Nevada, and Utah, blacks were overrepresented, but in the remaining 28 states, blacks were underrepresented. One explanation for this is that most murder is intraracial. Black-on-black murders are more common and therefore underrepresented on death row, while black-on-white murders are less common and overrepresented on death row. In 2013, about 52.2% of those arrested for murder were black and 47.8% were white. One thing to just kind of think about here, in terms of UCR data, Hispanic is recorded as ethnicity, Hispanic or non-Hispanic. So Hispanics are generally categorized as white. Inclusion of Hispanics in this category inflates the white numbers. When we remove Hispanics, though, the black homicide rate is 12.7 times higher than the white homicide rate. Keep in mind, though, that only a small portion of murders are death eligible, and only a small proportion of those murders actually receive a death sentence. So looking at this data, it would seem that white murderers are proportionately more likely both to receive a death sentence and to be executed. Now, southern states are the ones in which blacks are the most underrepresented on death row relative to the numbers of murders they commit. One explanation could be southern states have a large black population and therefore they're less likely to favor the death penalty than whites. Or perhaps prosecutors, judges, and juries are more careful in these states in handling minority cases. So one thing that we've heard a lot about is victim's race, that the victim's race matters. And the literature does consistently show that people who kill white people are more likely to receive the death penalty. This could be because we know that homicide is overwhelmingly intraracial. So same race victims, same race offender. Prosecutors might be reluctant to seek the death penalty for blacks, and that might reflect a devaluation of those victims compared to their white counterparts. So maybe black on black crime doesn't threaten the white power structure. Now, a victim-centered concept of justice is where the focus has moved from a bias against black defendants to a bias against black victims, or a bias in favor of white victims, especially white women. So perhaps this bias is operating so that if you are a white victim, and in particular a white female victim, your case is more likely to warrant the death penalty. Now, before we control for things like aggravating and mitigating factors, all studies show that people who kill white people are more likely to receive the death penalty. Gross and Morrow in 1989 found out that 28.8% of blacks who killed whites under felony circumstances received the death penalty, compared to 6% of blacks who killed blacks. Whites who killed blacks got the death penalty 18% of the time. Whites who kill blacks are more likely to receive the death penalty than blacks who kill blacks. Again, keep in mind that whites commit about 4% of interracial homicides, and blacks commit about 95% of interracial murders. Now, Sharma and colleagues looked at first-degree murder convictions in Tennessee, and they looked at prosecutors who sought the death penalty, and this happened with 76% of white defendants and 62% of black defendants, 64% of white victims, and 33% of black victims. In terms of who received the death penalty, 37% of white defendants for whom it was sought received the death penalty, and 23% of black defendants for whom it was sought received the death penalty. Strongest predictors of getting the death penalty were killing a police officer, a history of prior violent offenses, and other evidence. The victim's race was not statistically significant, but the victim's sex, female, was statistically significant. Whites were 2.26 times more likely to receive the death penalty than blacks over the 30-year period. Now, another author looked at a little over 1,000 capital cases, found that blacks who killed whites in high severity circumstances had an increased probability of the death penalty, but blacks who killed whites at low levels of severity had a decreased probability of receiving the death penalty. Now, what's high severity? High severity has multiple aggravating factors. Under low severity, a black who kills a white had almost half the odds of getting the death penalty than a black who kills a black or a white who kills anyone. Now, this is an odd finding to try to explain. They look at then the average number of aggravating factors in cases, and in black on white cases, it was 2.2 aggravating factors. In white on black cases, 1.4. Black on black cases, 1.96, and white on white, 1.84. So let's look at this situation here. Baldus and colleagues note that it is in the middle range of aggravating circumstances where the correct sentence is less clear and those racial disparities appear. Katz looked at the same data as Baldus. There were 141 cases involving a white victim and a black perpetrator. 67% of these, the victim was killed during a robbery, compared to 7.4% in black victim cases. In about 70% of white victim cases, the victim was a stranger. White victim homicide show a greater percentage of mutilation, execution-style murders, tortures, wow, that's a lot of typos in a row, and beaten victims, which are all aggravating factors. So once we include all the mitigating and aggravating factors, there is little or no discrimination in terms of those white victim, black perpetrator cases. Paternoster and Brame looked at death-eligible cases in Maryland, found no race of defendant bias, but did find significant race of victim effects. That black offender, white victim cases were 3.5 times more likely than any other combination to receive a death sentence. Berkeley and Hickman looked at the same data and found that dyad was less likely to have a death sentence. Jennings did a more sophisticated analysis and looked at every death-eligible case in North Carolina from 1977 to 2009 and used what's called propensity score matching. So this is where you try to overcome a demonstrated effect by comparing a particular treatment, so in this case, offender-victim dyads, with those who received a death sentence and those who received life without parole. So what you do is you try to match everything in your case using this propensity score matching. They controlled for 50 legal and non-legal factors. And regardless of the offender's race, there was a significant odds ratio of 1.393. The odds of receiving the death penalty if the victim is white are 1.393 times higher. And so that's regardless of the offender's race. With a black offender, white victim, the odds ratio is 2.834. So in those cases, those offenders are 2.8 times more likely to get the death penalty. Okay, now once they apply this propensity matching score, the odds ratio is close to 0. So this white victim effect is more of a case effect, what's happening in those cases, as opposed to a race effect. Of course, we also want to remember that when we're looking at these studies, they're looking at different jurisdictions, and what holds true in one place might not hold true in another. We also expect too much from what we already know is pretty limited data. There's a lot of variables and a small number of homicides in each jurisdiction. So the issue that really remains is once we've taken into account aggravating and mitigating circumstances and the strength of the evidence, is the death penalty still warranted? So let's look at juveniles. The youngest person ever executed was 12-year-old Hannah Okish, a Pequot Indian girl with an intellectual disability, and she was convicted of killing a six-year-old white girl in 1786 in Connecticut. Now, the first person to be executed in what would become the U.S. was a 16-year-old boy named Thomas Granger. He was hanged in 1642 for bestiality with several farm animals. Since then, 365 juveniles have been executed in the United States, and from 1973 to 2003, 22 were executed. This is a result of public outrage at high violent crimes in the 80s and 90s, where 15 to 19-year-olds had the second highest homicide rate. Scott Haim was the last person to be executed before the juvenile death penalty was ruled unconstitutional. He was 17 and with an accomplice carjacked an automobile occupied by a man and a woman. They robbed them, locked them in the trunk, set the car on fire, and killed the occupants. And he was executed in 2003 by lethal injection. Now, in 1899, the juvenile court is established, in part because we believe that adult punishments are not appropriate for kids. And to give you a one-sentence history of juvenile justice, by the 60s, we've afforded most juveniles the same rights as most of the same rights as adults. This has also then put us on a path towards treating juveniles like adults. So in 1977, 16-year-old Monty Lee Eddings and his friends stole a car. They were stopped by an officer that Eddings shot and killed. So it's the first time the Supreme Court looked at age as an important factor in determining a death sentence. And here it was used as a mitigating factor. In Thompson v. Oklahoma, they said they drew the line at 16. Stanford v. Kentucky, they sort of set that minimum age at 16. And in Roper v. Simmons, this is where it became unconstitutional to execute anybody who was under the age of 18 at the time they committed their offense. Now, there's nothing magical about turning 18. In English common law, anyone under 7 was considered incapable of committing a crime, and if you were between 7 and 14, you could be held accountable if the prosecution could prove you fully understood what you did was wrong. Now, today we consider 18 to be an adult, and that age was lowered during the Vietnam War from 21 as we started drafting 18-year-olds to the war. But science tells us our brain is not fully mature until our mid-20s, and that 25 is a more natural benchmark for adulthood. Now let's look at women in the death penalty. The first woman to be executed in what would become the United States was Jane Champion, and she was executed in 1632 for murdering her illegitimate infant. The first woman executed by the federal government was Mary Surratt, and she was a conspirator in the assassination of Lincoln, and she was hanged. Women are about 2% of executions in the United States, and they've been about 0.9% of those executed since 1976. Now, women commit only about 10% of homicides per year, and most of those are of spouses or significant others in self-defense. So it's pretty rare that they commit the kind of heinous murders that warrant the death penalty. But if women were treated equally, about 4 to 6% of female murderers would receive the death penalty. So, can chivalry explain that? What are the extra legal factors that save some female murderers from death row? Is it chivalrous paternalistic attitudes? Are we just reluctant to impose the death penalty on women? There's also the counterpart of this, which is sort of this evil woman idea. And we've talked about this before in regards to other criminal offending. That women who defy traditional gender roles by not enacting a feminine identity tend to be punished more harshly. Now, what about the death penalty in people who are mentally ill? So, in Philadelphia in 1987, about 5 months apart, two killers kidnapped, raped, and tortured women in Philly, and they didn't know each other. Both of them were luring prostitutes to their homes and imprisoning them in their basements. Gary Heidnik was white, schizophrenic, killed 5 less women than Graham, and was executed in 1999. Graham was black, mildly mentally retarded, was given 6 death sentences, which could not be carried out until his earlier life without parole sentence was completed. Is this a race difference? Is mental disability more mitigating than mental illness? So Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, written in 1765, says that idiots and lunatics are not chargeable for their own acts if committed when under these incapacities. So what we're talking about here is mental illness and mental disabilities. So the primary issues for the court are, is the person competent to stand trial? At the time of the offense, did they have the ability to form mens rea? And does the mental condition warrant a more lenient sentence? Now, a mental disability is a lifelong condition of impaired or incomplete mental development, and it has 3 main criteria. Significantly sub-average intellectual functioning, so that is generally an IQ under 70, which is the bottom 2% of the population, which is about the functioning of a 12 or 13-year-old. Concurrent and related limitations in 2 or more adaptive skill areas, and it needs to manifest before the age of 18. Now, this doesn't mean you're not held responsible for your actions, but that there's lower level of culpability. Now, in 1979, parole rapist John Penry was sentenced to death for a brutal rape and murder in Texas. The jury was told that it couldn't consider his low IQ as mitigating evidence. His case makes it to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court holds that juries can consider mental retardation as a mitigating factor, but actually imposing the death penalty is not a per se violation. Now, in Atkins, about 2002, the court overruled itself. It says that our national consensus is against executing the mentally disabled. They are less culpable, more prone to confess to crimes they did not commit, and therefore more prone to wrongful conviction. But the answer here is it supposed to be objective, right? Or it is supposed to be objective. The person either is or is not mentally retarded, but it depends on what the experts say. So Pizzuto was a death row inmate who killed 2 people and had an IQ of 72, which is only 2 points above that 70 cutoff. Now, he argued that with a 5-point margin of error, his IQ could really be as low as 68. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal said, yeah, that 5-point margin of error also means it could be as high as, that should say, 77. The big issue was that his mental retardation was not established prior to his 18th birthday. So, mental retardation is permanent and unalterable. So that's what makes it unconstitutional to execute those people. But mental illness can be managed with medication, so it's not unconstitutional to execute the mentally ill. If you are presently insane, you cannot be executed. Now, this first comes up in Jackson v. Indiana, which is not a death penalty case. But because Jackson was incompetent, he was committed to a psychiatric hospital. And if a person is unrestorably incompetent, then what would have happened in this case is Jackson would have been given a life sentence for theft. And the Supreme Court said it's constitutionally impermissible to commit a defendant for an indefinite period of time based on their incompetence to stand trial. So we either need to civilly commit them or release them from criminal detention. So states then start to look at how can we restore someone's competency. And this is happening at the same time that effective psych meds are being developed. Now, in Ford v. Wainwright, No competency issues are raised during Ford's trial, and Ford is sentenced to death. While on death row, he claimed to become insane, and 3 out of 4 psychiatrists who examined him agreed that he was psychotic. Supreme Court said if he's currently mentally incompetent and free of the threat of immediate execution, he would still have to prove that he was as mentally ill as he claimed to be. But they didn't give us any procedural standards to make sure that there is proper due process for folks claiming incompetency. In Panetti v. Quarterman, they went beyond that mere awareness to a rational understanding. So Panetti had a long history of schizophrenic-like behavior, that should be BX behavior, for which he was taking medication. He was found competent to stand trial and waive legal counsel. And the Supreme Court declined to follow Atkins and overturned his death sentence. They did order a stay of execution and send the case back to Texas to evaluate his incompetence. And less than 12 hours before a scheduled execution was given a stay of execution. So the law on competency and execution is still murky. What do we mean by having a rational understanding? This does mean, though, that we can render someone competent with medication. So the issue becomes, do we forcibly medicate somebody in order to execute them? And the Supreme Court has held that in a prison environment, an inmate can be involuntarily medicated if the inmate is so dangerous to himself or others and the treatment is in their best interest. And that wraps up the chapter on special population.